I've got the absolute pleasure of introducing Heather Nancarrow. Heather is the Chief Executive Officer of ANROWS, which is Australia's national research organisation for women's safety. Heather has 36 years' experience in working in the prevention of violence against women, including direct service provision, policy and legislation, research and professional development. The Foundation Director of the Queensland Centre for Domestic and Family Violence Research, Heather held a position from 2003 until her move to ANROWS in 2014. So there's a wealth of experience there. Heather has held many leadership roles at both the state and national level in regard to policy on the prevention of violence against women, and this includes co-deputy chair of COAG Advisory Panel to Reduce Violence Against Women 2015-16. She's also a member of the Queensland Premier Special Task Force on Domestic and Family Violence 2014-15 and the Deputy Chair of the National Council to Reduce Violence Against Women 2008-2009. Heather has a Masters of Arts in Criminology and Criminal Justice with first-class honours. Her primary research interests are justice responses to violence against women, particularly as they relate to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So I'd really like to welcome Heather.
Thank you very much for that very warm welcome to your town, Parkes. I'm really pleased to be here. I'm very sorry that I wasn't able to be here for the Welcome to Country yesterday morning, but I was delighted to be able to meet Kaya last night, and I'd like to acknowledge Kaya and elders of the Wiradjuri people, past, present and future, and I'd like to pay my respects to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people everywhere, and particularly those who are present here today. I also wanted just to thank my buddy, Kath Babbitt. Kath was such a great buddy that she joined me on the trivia team last night, abandoning her own staff. But that was a bad move, as it turned out, because the ditched by Kath team actually won the trivia night. So, but thanks, Kath, for your support, and thanks to the organisers for having me here this morning. It really is a great pleasure to be able to come to Parkes and join you for this really important conference and to contribute to it. So let me tell you about ANROWS. I want to talk a little bit about that first, the structure of it. I think it's a... Here we go. It's a milestone organisation in lots of ways, and particularly, as you heard, I've been working in this field for a very long time. When I started working in this field, I would never have imagined that we would have arrived at a point where we would have a national research organisation funded collectively by the Commonwealth and every state and territory in Australia to fund research on violence against women and their children. And the reason I say that is because, well, two reasons. One is that when I started working in a refuge in 1981, we all thought that we'd have this problem over and done with in 10 years. We thought we'd all be out of a job. And sadly, you know, we're still here. And I think one of the reason I say that ANROWS is so important in the range of responses that we have to violence against women and their children is that after 40 years of advocacy on this issue and an effort to stop violence against women and their children, we still have a very massive problem in our country. And I firmly believe, and clearly the governments do, that we need to have evidence to guide our decision-making in policy and in practice, and really that's the essence of what ANROWS is about. We are there to produce evidence to support your work, support the work of government in policy development, and to support the work of practitioners in guiding their work for clients. So we'll move on to the next one. So just to show you that we're a company, a not-for-profit company. The members of our company are the Commonwealth and the state and territories of Australia, so every one of them. And obviously, as the Crown, they have a nominated representative on as the member of the company to attend our AGM, for example. Oh, sorry, can you just go back one? We operate under a board, so our governance structure includes a board, and it's a very unusual model, but I think a very effective one, in that we've got 10 board directors. We always have a Commonwealth Government Director, and at any one time there are 3 state or territory directors, and they rotate every 2 years. Now, the reason I point that out, and further, there are then 6 independent directors. So the chair is always independent, and 5 of the other directors are independent directors. So the balance of power is with the independents, and that's really important as a research organisation, that we're not seen to be a mouthpiece for government, But it also is equally important, in my view, that we have government very much engaged in the governance of ANROWS, because at the end of the day we have to get their support to take up the evidence in their work. And I think that by having them invested so much in ANROWS, not only as funders but as directors on our board, it puts a responsibility on government to make sure that not only does ANROWS succeed in delivering research, but in taking up evidence in policy and supporting the take-up of evidence in practice. So we'll move on to just briefly the structure. We're very small. Currently we have 9 staff in our core grant. So we talk about our core grant, and then we have a number of other projects funded by different governments or organisations. So I don't know why I'm turning back there. I think it's because the glasses on, glasses off thing really annoys me. So the Chief Executive Officer is me. I have a small support staff, Executive Officer and Office Manager. We have a Director Research Program, and I've just recently advertised the position of Director Evidence to Action. So that really, again, I think really highlights what we're about. We're moving into the evidence to action phase, having run our first research program. So I'll come back to that a little bit as well. If we move on to the next slide, I want to highlight that the reason we exist, our primary focus is safety for women and their children. However, our primary stakeholders are governments, practitioners and researchers. So we're quite removed from direct client service, as you can see. Our job really is there. Whilst women and their children are our primary focus, our work is about supporting your work and the work of policy developers. So in order to achieve the role that we've been given by the... sorry, I don't know if I said we've established under the Australia's National Research Organisation... Sorry, let me start again. We're established under the National Plan to Reduce Violence Against Women and their Children, 2010 to 2022. Is everybody aware that we have a national plan to reduce violence against women and their children? It's a 12-year plan to be implemented through a series of 4 3-year action plans. And governments are working on the are currently working on the 3rd of 4 action plans. So we're halfway through the life of the national plan. Our job is to lead national effort to enhance the research base, or the evidence base, in domestic, family and sexual violence across research, education and service delivery organisations in support of the national plan, and to focus on translating evidence into information to support ongoing improvement in the work of practitioners and to inform policy development. So to give effect to these roles, we developed a conceptual model which is on the slide there. So it's knowledge production, knowledge translation, exchange and leadership. So they're the 3 core intersecting functions which we see as our approach to research overall. In this paper, I'm actually going to focus a bit more on the evidence to action, because I think that's, both are, obviously we can't put evidence to action if we're not building and continuing to build the evidence. So I'll talk about that as well briefly. But I want to make sure we've got plenty of time for questions and discussion. So in terms of our leadership role, the first role we had was to develop the National Research Agenda to reduce violence against women and their children. And we did that through working with governments and practitioners and researchers around the country, and we undertook 2 gap analyses, one on statistical information and one on the literature in Australia in the last 10 years on what's the current state of knowledge on violence against women in Australia. And so from that produced a national research agenda, and then from that, in collaboration with the jurisdictions, all of the jurisdictions that are funding us, all of them, 9 jurisdictions, we identified priorities for the first program of research for ANROWS. So our first program of research was announced in October 2014, so not quite 2 years ago. So we're still very young, as you can see. We go on to the next slide? Yeah. So under the ANROWS Core Grant Research Program, we funded 20 projects worth $3.5 million. That's a lot of money for non-government organisations. You'll know that's a lot of money. There's no way that any one jurisdiction in Australia would fund research to the value of $3.5 million. But because they have worked together, and pooled their resources, they're able to fund that, and all of those jurisdictions will benefit from the evidence that we produce. So they've finally got to understand that we need a national plan and we need to coordinate and collaborate, pool resources, and we can all benefit from that to a much greater extent than we would if we were continuing to fund bits and pieces of projects without a coordinated national approach. So I think that's really important too. So ANROWS collaborates with individual jurisdictions and researchers and practitioners to produce knowledge. For example, in addition to our core grant, we've got a program of research. We've just called for applications. We're now assessing applications for a program of research for perpetrator interventions on violence against women. So it's domestic, family and sexual assault again. And that's another $3 million program of research that's funded entirely by the Commonwealth Government, but it's funded by the Commonwealth Government to support the states and territories in the implementation of the national outcome standards for perpetrator interventions. Those outcome standards were released by COAG, Council of Australian Governments, in December last year, and so now we're developing a program of research to support the implementation of those standards. We estimate that there are over 100 individuals in academic, policy and practice roles collaborating with ANROWS on the delivery of the program of research. I want to emphasise that because we don't see that knowledge resides in universities alone. We see that practice wisdom is equally important in terms of evidence, and that we want to ensure that we support and build capacity and provide opportunities for collaboration between practitioners, policymakers and researchers in the production of knowledge and evidence for the work that you all do. Plus that is a really key strategy for implementation of evidence into policy and practice. To date, the ANROWS, next slide please. Oh, we're there, great. To date, the ANROWS research program, which I said was launched less than 2 years ago, has produced 19 landscapes papers. So landscapes are what we call state of knowledge papers, or what might generally be known as a literature review, but it goes beyond a literature review because, as I said, we also value practice wisdom and grey literature, what we call grey literature. So material that's not published in peer-reviewed journals, for example. So often literature reviews are limited to that kind of knowledge, whereas we take a broader approach to what counts as knowledge and evidence, and so the state of knowledge papers are broader than a traditional literature review. I'd like to give you a brief sample of some of the, I should also say the Horizons research reports. To date, we've only delivered 4 of them. So we delivered the 19 out of 20 projects had a first stage was the state of knowledge paper. And for non-government organisations in the room, you would appreciate that we were initially funded for 3 years. We launched our first program of research after having established a national research agenda and established an organisation in Sydney from scratch that we then had to deliver for governments and demonstrate our value to them so that they would refund us for another term. So that our strategy was to produce the state of knowledge papers separately from the empirical research reports. So we just now, less than 2 years in, have delivered 19 state of knowledge papers and 4 Horizons papers. So 4 reports from empirical research have been produced by ANROWS in 18 months. And each of those Horizons reports has, and the ones to come will have, what we're calling a compass. A compass paper is a research to policy and practice. So it's we need, as a research organisation, we need to have the very rigorous academic kind of paper to demonstrate the rigour and the methodological rigour of the research, so that it's defensible, so it can be critiqued and the evidence can be tested in that way. But we also need then to be able to provide a synthesis of that for people that we want to use the knowledge, that they don't have to wade through a couple of hundred pages of academic writing, but they have access to a brief summary and the implications for research and practice. For policy and practice. So I wanted to give you a sample of 3, but just quite briefly. So one is a further analysis of the personal safety survey. The ABS is conducting that personal safety survey now under the national plan. Every 4 years that survey will be repeated. I want to talk to you a little bit about the Patricia project, which I think will be of particular interest to this group. And I wanted to just highlight the innovative models of addressing violence against Indigenous women, and that's I think also a good example of how our researchers are collaborating, university-based researchers collaborating with community-based people in building knowledge. So I'm just going to give you a brief, if we could just move on to the next one. Just, the personal safety survey shows that 1 in 3 women in Australia and 1 in 2 men have experienced physical violence since the age of 15. So we see that men experience more violence than do women. However, both men and women are 3 times more likely to be physically assaulted by a man. So we can see, there's a gender difference in terms of who are the perpetrators and who are the victims. Another gender difference is that for women are most likely to be assaulted in their own home by someone they know, usually their intimate partner, whereas men are most likely to be assaulted in their place of entertainment. So there are significant gender differences, which is why we need to have different approaches. And it's not to say that we shouldn't be dealing with, we should absolutely be dealing with violence against men, but we need to understand where priorities are and it needs a different kind of approach. We absolutely need to have a focus on preventing violence against women and their children, and it needs a very specific approach, which is the work that we're doing. Peter Cox is the Senior Research Officer at ANROWS who did this further analysis of the Personal Safety Survey, and her research, unlike the previous analysis conducted by the ABS, was able to draw out not only the current and former partner relationships, but also those who are in dating girlfriend-boyfriend kind of relationships. And so whereas previously the information from ABS showed that 1 in 6 women had been victims of intimate partner violence, because Peter's analysis was able to include girlfriend-boyfriend relationships, sadly it's actually 1 in 4. So a quarter of Australian women have experienced intimate partner violence since the age of 15. Over 500,000 women reported that their children had witnessed violence. 2 million women experienced emotional abuse by a cohabiting partner. And 1.7 million women experienced sexual violence. So sexual violence includes threats of violence, and 1.5 million women in Australia since the age of 15 experienced sexual assault. 99% of those assaults were perpetrated by a male. I'll just turn now briefly to the Patricia project. This is the one conducted by Professor Cathy Humphreys from University of Melbourne. Many of you, I'm sure, will be familiar with her work. Cathy has produced a State of Knowledge paper which is available at the ANROWS website. She also gave a very powerful and informative presentation at the ANROWS conference in February. Yes, we've also run a national conference within our first 18 months in February this year, and Cathy's presentation is also on our website, so I'd encourage you to have a look at that more closely as well. Cathy's research has 5 components. It's started off as being a project in New South Wales and Victoria, and because of the nature of the project, which is really about investigating how work can better be done, so integration of work between domestic violence services, child protection services can enhance responses and get better outcomes for children who are affected by domestic and family violence. And the Child and Family Services, collectively the states and territories through the Commonwealth and CAFs, contributed further money to that project, came to ANROWS and said, we would like to expand that research. We know that you don't have further resources to do it, so we'd like to put in more dollars to do that. So that's how important the states and territories collectively see this particular project and what it can bring to your work in working with families and children to make sure that children who are exposed to violence, and we saw how many there are previously, can benefit from this research. What's interesting about this research also is that the CAFS funding expanded the sites to Western Australia for Study 1, so New South Wales, Victoria and Western Australia for mapping the pathways through a quantitative analysis of data from those jurisdictions. But it has also expanded the jurisdictions to include Queensland and South Australia, so now 5 jurisdictions in doing case studies, looking at the way that the jurisdictions are responding to the intersections of child protection and domestic violence, so that we can all, as a nation, learn from that work. CAF's also funded an expansion to include a focus on perpetrator accountability. So how can child protection systems hold perpetrators of domestic violence accountable, whereas traditionally those systems have focused on working with mothers and holding mothers accountable for violence experienced by their children, perpetrated by the children's father. You know, so that's a big sort of shift that we, as a nation, are working on, and every jurisdiction is doing some work in that area. But this research will really highlight how, you know, from these case studies and from, you know, from the perpetrator intervention or perpetrator accountability aspect, how best to do that work and to get the best outcomes for children. And the final component of that, or one thing that I think is worth highlighting, is that Cathy's engaged in an action research methodology, and that's something that I think we're going to see increasing, and certainly something we're engaged in. In fact, the Commonwealth Government has funded 28 Building Safer Communities for Women projects around the country, and have contracted ANROWS to provide action research support to those 28 organisations around the country. So we're providing expert support around action research methodology, because this is the way we can continuously build evidence and incorporate evidence into practice in a sort of a process of continuous improvement. I'll turn now to this research on innovative models of addressing violence against Indigenous women. Ironically, probably the most eminent researcher on violence against Indigenous women in Australia is Professor Harry Blagg. Harry's a white man from the UK, but he's been doing work in the Kimberley region of Western Australia for more than 20 years, and he's very much embraced by those communities in the Fitzroy Valley in particular. And he's been working very closely with a group of women. His project has also delivered a State of Knowledge paper, and that State of Knowledge paper is really highlighting the importance of cultural responses, not culturally appropriate responses, but cultural approaches to responding to violence against Indigenous women, and the recognition that we need to have, that communities need to develop their own strategies. They've got answers, and that we need to be able to find ways to support Aboriginal communities and Torres Strait Islander communities to work within their own context and build, identify their own ways of doing things. In effect, what that paper is saying, we have to decolonise the way that responses to violence against women occur. And I think we need to decolonise research as well. So what do I mean by that, by decolonising? I'm going to refer to a quote here from Linda Tue-Smith, who's a Maori scholar. Linda wrote, "When Indigenous peoples become the researchers and not merely the researched, the activity of research is transformed. Questions are framed differently, priorities are ranked differently, problems are defined differently, and people participate on different terms." We've moved some way towards that. So if we can just go back to the previous slide. So Harry's working with these. So in this picture, you'll see on the left, it's not, sorry, the quality's not that great. But if you're looking at the picture on the left is Kerry Tim. Kerry's a principal advisor in the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet on Indigenous Affairs. Next to her is Karen Nungala Woodley from Queensland, June Oscar from Fitzroy Crossing in Western Australia, and Auntie Eileen Cummins from Darwin. So they're the 3 sites. Queensland, Western Australia and Darwin, Northern Territory, are the 3 sites for this project on innovative models for addressing violence against Indigenous women. And those 3 women are the project leaders in each of those 3 jurisdictions. They're not trained researchers, but they've been engaged in research in different capacities. They have a lot of expertise in working on violence against women, but a lot of expertise, absolute experts on violence against Indigenous women and Indigenous culture. And so that's the expertise that they're bringing to this research project. So if we move on to knowledge translation and exchange. And so, is someone timekeeping for me?
Yes.
Yeah, great, thank you. How am I going?
Going well.
Good, excellent. So, knowledge translation and exchange, what is it and how do we do it? So, it's an emerging field of practice and field of inquiry, particularly as it now moves beyond medicine and primary health, where it's been the subject of academic inquiry since the 1970s. Essentially, it's a process of translating knowledge in ways that facilitate the uptake of evidence in policy and practice. Sounds deceptively simple. KT is defined by the Canadian Institutes of Health Research as a dynamic and iterative process that includes synthesis, dissemination, exchange and ethically sound application of knowledge. Further, the website that I've just referred to recognises that this process takes place within a complex system of interactions between researchers and knowledge users, which may vary in intensity, complexity and level of engagement depending on the nature of the research and the findings, as well as the needs of the particular knowledge user. So knowledge users being practitioners and policymakers in the context of ANROWS' work. In 2014 we commissioned, in fact the first State of Knowledge paper that we commissioned was on knowledge translation exchange, because we felt, you know, this is an emerging area of practice, we need to learn about it, this is what we're engaged in, we need to know, what's best practice in this area. The review found, well, it included 24 studies in the violence against women field internationally, which met the inclusion criteria, but most of those studies were in the health medical area. The review incorporated the Knowledge to Action framework published by Graham and nursing scientist colleagues in 2006 to provide a map for the KTE process. So if we go to the next slide, we'll see this map. It represents the dynamic and iterative process of KTE in the complex system of interactions between knowledge creators and knowledge users, which I mentioned earlier. At the centre of the diagram is the knowledge creation funnel. It demonstrates 3 phases in the process of distilling and funneling knowledge into action, tailored to meet the needs of knowledge users. It has 7 bi-directional action phases, and these are situated around the knowledge creation funnel. So, you know, that it can go back and forward through these different phases of the process of building evidence and funneling evidence into action. The ANROWS review identified multiple theoretical models of knowledge translation and exchange. But most of the 24 violence against women studies included in the ANROWS review related to knowledge translation exchange for health professionals, and only one was aimed at policymakers. Most used a pre- and post-test repeated measures design to identify within subject changes following the KT intervention. So, you know, sorry, that's just probably explaining a bit about the methodology. Probably what's of more interest is that you know, what kind of approaches were most commonly used. So they were educational, patient-mediated interventions, and again you can see the health focus there, organisational interventions such as practice guidelines, and linkage and exchange interventions. From these, there have been a few systematic reviews, so where, you know, researchers bring together you know, the evaluations or a review of the broader results of other examinations of this particular research question or particular topic. And from these systematic reviews identified that a number of potentially useful strategies. So on this slide you'll be able to see, I won't read it all, you can read that for yourself, but just to highlight that these are the strategies that the systematic reviews suggest might be most helpful for knowledge translation exchange in our field. I found an article too, a very interesting article from another Canadian. So I think the Canadians are the experts on knowledge translation exchange currently. But there's a paper by Benoit Gauthier, who's the president of the Canadian Evaluation Society, and he talks about the KT equation. So he says that to have impact depends on content and influence, and each of those 2 elements have multiple components. So if we just go to the next slide, I think let's probably just go through that. So content has 4 components. So quantity. So obviously there must be evidence to exist that exists. Quality refers to the quality of the evidence, that defines the volume of content, but it's to some extent subjective, and it also relates to claims made on the basis of evidence. So, quality is subjective, and it depends on the audience who, the end user who we're trying to influence, and their interpretation or their assessment of the quality, which is why we have to do those very rigorous academic papers as well as the Compass papers that we do. Accessibility of the content, so it's got to be adapted, tailored and packaged for relevant audiences. And congruency, so the degree of congruence or cognitive dissonance between existing beliefs. So how far is the evidence that we're providing, or how close is it to the current knowledge, beliefs, values of the organisation we're trying to influence, or the body we're trying to influence, or is there, is there a significant dissonance there? And that's a real challenge if there is. Influence also actually has 5 components. So it's credibility of the source, so it has to be from a trusted source. Congruence again of the source with the aims of the decision maker. Timeliness of the evidence, so that's always a challenge for researchers to be able to deliver within a time frame that is of benefit to particularly governments and policymakers. Self-scrutiny, so the question about whether the end users are open to scrutiny and willing to be challenged about their current practice and change on the basis of evidence. And expediency, there's always going to be some challenges around expediency and political expedience in particular. Most of these things ANROWS has control over, and I think that we're in a good place given that the Australian governments collectively have funded us for this particular purpose. So they trust us, they're on our board, they're members of our company, they have funded us again. They're clearly open to self-scrutiny because they've funded us for this very purpose, to build evidence to support policy and practice. So we're doing pretty well, I think, in terms of meeting the components of the equation that's necessary for knowledge translation and exchange. What we can't control is the expedient components. So, we've got no control over the politics of these things, but I have to say that everywhere in Australia you go, and I'm sure that you are very aware of this, that that regardless of the the party politics, all parties in Australia and in Tasmania, they talk about tripartisan support for violence against women prevention initiatives, and generally we talk about bipartisan, but it's interesting because the Greens are very strong in Tasmania, so they do have tripartisan support there. So I just want to now turn to ANROWS' approach to knowledge translation and exchange, and particularly to highlight Goal 2 and Goal 3 starting with Goal 2 of our strategic plan. And Goal 2 is to ensure effective dissemination and application of research findings. So you'll note that it's 2 components. It's dissemination and application. So dissemination is relatively easy. I won't say it's easy. All of the materials that we have produced are available on our website. We also print, we distribute them through our networks and so on. But what's really more challenging, thank you, is the take-up. What do we do to get the evidence taken up into policy and practice? That's the really challenging bit, and the bit that we're now moving more directly into, having spent our first 3 years almost, coming up to 3 years, producing evidence. And of course we've been doing some knowledge translation and exchange along the way, including our national conference, for example. And we've held co-convened events with ministers in various jurisdictions and forums around the state of knowledge papers that we've produced. But we're now really moving more into that evidence to the application of evidence into action, hence the director evidence to action position, which, by the way, applications close for on Sunday night at midnight. So if you know anybody who would be brilliant for that job, let them know of it's on the website. But we really do need a cracker of a director in that role to make this work. So Goal 3, so the evidence to action, Goal 2 is about the evidence to action. Goal 3 is actually about partnerships and relationships and building collaboration with with you all, you know, with everybody who's working in the field, whether it's in policy development or in practice. We can't do this work without you. We can't. You may be able to do work without us, but you can do it better with us. We're there to help you figure out what's the best approach based on current knowledge and best practice. So there are a number of strategies. I think if we just move to the next slide. In terms of the dissemination, we have a fortnightly notepad. So in that, an update on what ANROWS has been up to, but also the latest research, so articles, and most of them you can link to directly onto our website. We also have information about training sessions and various other things that are happening around the country that may be of interest to you. I won't read all of them because time is short. But just so that you're aware of the range of things, and if you subscribe to ANROWS, then you will receive in your inbox every fortnight ANROWS notepad. So you'll know what we're up to and what the latest research is and whatever else is going on in the violence against women field, including behind the news, which is about what's going on in the media. In the second last slide, strategy and activities. Just want to highlight a few things there. So I've mentioned some of this already, but there's a networking database. So if you're interested in, as a practitioner or a policymaker, in contributing to a research team, we've created a networking database on our website, which enables researchers and practitioners and policymakers to register their interest in particular research areas, and that helps you and them form research teams or research partnerships to undertake work for ANROWS or not for ANROWS, for someone else. We have a practitioners engagement group, and that group's really important. We've just called for expressions of interest in the second term of membership of that group. When that group formed a year ago, we were still developing conceptually what our evidence to action would look like. And how we might engage with that group more. And so we've refined the terms of reference, and they have a really important role, and we're really seeking people who are decision makers in practice and have influence over practice, policy or programs in their organisations on a wide scale, so that they can take practice into their workplaces and influence practice nationally based on the evidence. So I just want to say in closing that ANROWS will officially be 3 years old. It's achieved much in its short life, but has a long way to go. We'll continue to build the evidence with our new Director Evidence to Action, and we will embark more vigorously on translating evidence to action to ensure all women and their children in Australia can be safe and free from violence. That's the vision of the 12-year national plan under which we were established. ANROWS can produce the evidence and support the take-up of evidence in policy and practice, but we can't do it without you. So if we just go to the last slide, it's time to cross that bridge. I'd like to leave you with a couple of questions to ponder, and of course I'm happy to answer any questions you may have of me. But you don't have to answer them now, but I'd like you to ponder those questions, and also I'll provide the hint there as where you may find the evidence to support your practice.
Thank you, Heather. Okay, we're open to questions.
Action. What is their role? What is their role going to be? Because I'm thinking in a lot of services where we know that we need to change things or do things differently. Is that going to be something that you're going to work on to help services change their strategies or change the way they work with people?
To the extent the Director Evidence to Action, their first job will be to write an operational plan on evidence to action for ANROWS that fits under the strategic plan. So I might just, if I can go quickly back, if I can find it, I had a few other points from the strategic plan, but essentially, I don't need to go back to it. Look, essentially that position will help us operationalise what that looks like in practice. You can appreciate that we're a really small organisation still. We plan to expand. The board will consider, once we've got that position in place, so I've got board approval to put the position on, and then work with me to develop what staffing we need under that. But we've got limited resources. We're not obviously able to go around to every workplace in Australia, so we have to be smart about how we do that. But I do see that it would be producing resources as a result of the evidence and translating that into practice tools, guidelines, you know, whatever it might be. And I think that some of that has to be worked out, because I'm really committed to figuring out what's going to work for whom and under what conditions. And that's the kind of research questions we have in terms of responding to violence against women and their children generally, but I think it's equally relevant to how do we support practitioners, what works for whom and under what conditions. And I think there will be a range of different approaches, and how we do that will be dictated by what end users need, but also what our resource capacity is. So we'll be holding a hand, but from a distance.
Any other questions? Oh, here.
Good morning. I'm just wondering around some of the coordination aspects, because at the moment there seems to be a lot of activity in this space and some of it's quite fragmented. So quite a number of us have just been involved in a consultation with DV New South Wales around some practice guidelines for working in rural and remote communities. Is that something you're doing in partnership with DV New South Wales?
No, it's not enough, you know, and I don't think that we can, you know, claim to be the only ones working in this area, or indeed that we should be the only ones. But your point's really important, and I think that the jurisdictions understand that we need to, at a higher level, have that. But at the same time, I think that, you know, we can't replace the work that people are currently doing, and some of our work might take longer than, you know, I mean, and we might find that the work that we don't need to do it because they've done such a great job. The issue then will be how can an initiative in New South Wales translate to other jurisdictions if it's driven locally, not by a national organisation. So I think that's you know, and maybe we can help them. I mean, I'm very committed, and having been working in this area for a long time, I'm very committed to work together, collaborate. And if somebody's doing a good job, let's support that rather than compete. So if we can support them if they're doing a great job with their guidelines and we think they should be rolled out nationally, then what role can we play in that?
Any further questions?
Very good. Okay. Well, I'm around for the whole day, so if anybody has any other questions or just want to have a yarn with me about what you're doing, I'd be very happy to do that. Thank you.